And if there's no sin, then there's no chastisement. Which brings up the question, for what should we discipline our children? I'll give you a few very simple examples from which you'll get the principle. If our children knock over a cup of tea so that it spills on the carpet, then we would say, well, should have been more careful. That was a bit clumsy, although we as adults can do that too ourselves. Then we think to ourselves, well, this is a nuisance to me because I have to clean it up. Or you may want to have the child clean up their own mess. That's a salutary lesson. They'll not do it as often then again. You're going to want to explain to them, take a bit more time. But you're not going to go all heavy with them, because it isn't a sin as such to knock over a cup of tea or coffee or juice. You're not actually breaking any of the 10 commandments. Right? But if the child did it on purpose or to defy you, then they're breaking the 5th commandment. And then you chastise them for that, and you make it clear to them that you are being disciplined here because you broke the 5th commandment. Not because I'm annoyed because I have to get down on my hands and knees and clean it up. You see the difference? We'll give more examples and it'll become even clearer. Let's say you have a smallish child who wets the bed. Well, what do you do then? Well, you change the sheets. And you say to yourself, maybe this child is a bit big for this sort of thing, but you're not going to beat him or her for it. You explain to them that, when you feel that urge, cross the hallway, go quickly. If on the other hand, the child lied and said, I didn't wet the bed, my brother or sister came into bed and she must have done it on me, then you get angry, righteously, and say to them, you're breaking the 9th commandment, you're telling lies. Wetting the bed is one thing, that can happen. Small people could do that sort of thing. But breaking the 9th commandment, that's sinful. If, for instance, the child falls and puts a hole in his new jeans, you think, well, we bought a pair of jeans, we're going to lose some money, although today maybe it's quite fashionable to have a patch on the jeans and maybe that's increased their value. But you're not too bothered about it because you're dealing with a child, and children will be children and they're more likely to fall over, so you tell them to be careful. If though you told the child you must not go out and play because you're in a good pair of jeans that your mother and I have bought for you and they're expensive, then the child went out and played football and put a hole in his trousers, then he is to be disciplined because he disobeyed you, breaking the 5th commandment. Then he is to be disciplined even if he doesn't put a hole in his trousers, because he broke the 5th commandment. That's the sin, not tearing the jeans as such. Now, we don't want our children to tear their jeans. You tell them. But there's a difference between our laws and God's laws. But when we, clothed with God's authority, tell them to do something and then they break our word, then they're breaking the 5th commandment. We identify the sin. The principle behind this is, what does God chasten us for? Does God chasten us and does he get all annoyed if we knock over a cup or if we put a hole in our jeans? He chastens us for sin. And that's how we chasten our children. And God says that he knows our frailty. He knows we're dust. And that's a good job too. It's a very caring word. He knows we're frail. He knows we can't handle that much. And that's how we relate to our children. God chastens us for our sins. That's the way we chasten our children. Let's take some other examples. Let's say your son or daughter is slow to walk or talk. That happens. Is that a sin? No. ought you, as the parent, to feel terribly embarrassed about that? Well, everybody else's children are walking or talking by this stage, and mine aren't, and I must be a terrible parent, or God has given me a child that's just no good. No. You can encourage the child to talk and walk, and there are things that you can do, or you could ask for some sort of professional help, but you don't ignore or despise the child for that. Children develop at different rates. That child may be a particularly good speaker in later years, or may become an athlete even though it doesn't walk at an early age. Because the scriptures tell us how God deals with his children. And Hosea 11 verse 3 tells us that God taught Israel to walk holding him by the arms. He didn't say, no, you're not walking with this stage. Bad child. He teaches them how to walk, and that's how we treat our children. If you have a boy or a girl that is not that good at sport, and you were, see, if you're not that big a sport, you probably wouldn't think it that good a sport in your day, you wouldn't think it was that big a deal. And you really wanted a boy who could be a top sportsman, and maybe you want to live your sporting achievements through him because you weren't that good, let's say, yourself. You want a son. You can put him in your place and he'll be a great star. But you don't put your son in the doghouse or reject him because he isn't very good at sport. You love the son God gave you. God sovereignly has determined how good your son is at these sports, and that's that. You love the son God gave you, not the one you imagined that you wanted. The one God has given you. And if your child is not the top of the class at school, and of course only one of the 30, or how many's in the class, can be, so you're going to have 29 disappointed parents, obviously. If your child is not the top of the class at school, you don't say, well, no birthday present for you this year. And then you think to yourself, well, maybe this child's abilities lie in more manual areas, and there's nothing wrong with that. Wonderful to have gifts and abilities like that. If, on the other hand, your child is lazy, that can be an issue. Or if he or she spends all his time playing games on the computer so that he doesn't do his homework, then you want to speak to him about that. Because 6 days shalt thou labour and do all thy work. And children need to be taught, and this is the 4th commandment, that they have a calling to work according to their capacity and in their spheres. Because this is the bottom line for us as Christians, we ask this question: how does God care for his children? Did he say to Israel, his son, there's nobody in this nation of Israel that has engineering skills like the great Egyptians who built pyramids? No engineers. My son's not a good engineer. I disown him. Does he say, the Babylonians have a wonderful hanging garden, the hanging garden of Babylon. My son isn't as good a gardener as the Babylonians. I'm embarrassed by him. Does God say that the men of Tyre are superb sailors? The son I have, no use in that area at all, and I just turn away from him in disgust. Or, to think of the Greeks, going around some of the surrounding nations, the Greeks are great athletes. My son is never going to make any of the sports team, and so I wonder sometimes if he's really my son at all. Well, God didn't chastise Israel for any of those things. But when Israel sinned and broke his commandments and cast off his covenant, then God frowned, and then God chastised Israel, explaining to Israel their iniquity and why they must be corrected. If we move on then to this, how does God discipline his children? You would all have to agree that God disciplines his children wisely appropriately, and oftentimes too with the chastisement specifically fitting the sin. If you think of Eli in 1 Samuel, the number one sin that the Bible identifies with him, though he was a godly man, but this was his weakness, he was too soft on his children. How did God chastise him? Eli saw those two sons die in one day. Shortly thereafter, he fell backwards and broke his neck. And he was an old man and heavy because he was eating some of the rich sacrifices that his sons had wrongly gotten. Very appropriate chastisement. David's greatest sin was his adultery with Bathsheba. How did God chasten him? They lost the child. Then God said to David, since you have committed adultery with Bathsheba secretly, your son Absalom will publicly lie with your concubines. Chastisement fitting the crime. And since your sin of adultery was a sin against your family, as well as against me, I will bring division in your family. And so we have Absalom's terrible revolt against his father, for instance. Solomon's great sin, marrying many pagan wives. The pagan wives brought paganism in, and he indulged for a time in the sin of idolatry. Hezekiah proudly showed the Babylonians his treasures. These ambassadors from that kingdom to the east, here, look at this, look at that. Isaiah came to him and said, because you have done this, all that these men have seen will be carted to Babylon. Wisely God chastises, appropriately and often, with the chastisement fitting the sin. And that's a model for us. Can't be done obviously in every circumstance, but it helps us in our rearing of the children to get home the point that what they did was wrong, and then if we can have the chastisement fitting it, it makes it clearer to them. And so, what sort of methods of chastisement can we use following the model of God's discipline of us and of Israel and of his church? Well, we can use this form of chastisement, the loss of things and privileges. God did that. You don't think going up to the temple and worshipping me is that big a deal? I'll smash your temple through the Babylonians. Oh. Well, we say that to our children. Since you have sinned in this area, you will not now be able to go to such and such a place. But again, we want to do it wisely and appropriately. We don't want to say you're grounded for 6 months because when I asked you to make me a cup of tea, you just sat there. We would all feel that to be too strict. So wisely and appropriately. Yeah. Then too, the rod. The rod, where appropriate, wisely. Because God said he would use the rod as a punishment on the Davidic kings. That's especially Psalm 89. I will chasten them with a rod. And so since God does that with his children, the Bible says the rod is to be used in certain circumstances with certain children. For example, in Proverbs 23:13-14 and 29 verse 15.